Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining. Thanks for joining us today. This is Chemere Davis. I am going to be finishing out Module 2 today. So I'll be setting the last, I'll be doing a little bit of last minute stage setting before we get into the introduction to machine learning next week. Again, today will be a little bit of summary from what we talked about over the last couple of weeks and a few new things that we'll talk about uncovering today when you get started with solving AI problems. All right, so on today's agenda, I'm going to do a quick review of the last session, so Tuesday's session. Then I'll talk about finding the right AI project. So what things do you have to consider with that? I'll talk about data limitations with AI, and I'll talk about a few tips that you can use to reduce the time to get started with AI. Then I'll summarize and we'll talk about what is coming up next week. Just a reminder, this is the second session of Module 2. We do have a study group and an Ask Me Anything session on Saturday. I believe this will be the last Saturday where we're going to hold it at 7 a.m. Pacific. In the subsequent weeks, we'll move it to 10 a.m. Pacific, so it'll be a little bit later in the day. And next Tuesday, we'll start with an introduction to machine learning, where you'll get to see some machine learning concepts and a few demos of some of the concepts before we get into the actual code in the Machine Learning Foundations course. All right, so I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes to just review the ways that AI helps machines learn, because we should keep these in mind as we talk about finding the right problems, because sometimes they help inform or shape the problem that you're going to solve. So as I mentioned in the last session, like one of the ways that AI helps machines is with perception. So this is where, a machine is going to do some, perceives the world. So like sensing what's going on in the world like we do by using information like text, images, videos, sound. And so you can relate that to things like speech and object or image recognition. We also talked about how machines can be really good at recognizing patterns with data. So that is really, that really does sum up a lot of what machine learning does. We do want AI to help machines be able to take some sort of action. So learning from those patterns and then being able to make a decision one way or another, or from a set of, possible decisions, taking some sort of action. And then the last is learning. So basically, using AI to help optimize performance based on failure or success on a continuous basis. A lot of problems that you might have come across or you may come across will, actually focus on, how do we, optimize this problem specifically. So AI can be used to do many very interesting and helpful things, but I just want to caution that just because you can use AI to accomplish a wide range of tasks, that doesn't mean that AI can do everything or that you should use it to do everything. So there are definitely times when AI may not be the best solution. And you'll want to overcome, some of those issues in order to be able to use AI. So we're going to right now we're going to put on our consultant hats and dive a little bit deeper into some of the major ways that you start the conversation about an AI or ML project. So one of the big ones is the ambiguously defined problem. So pretty much a very specific objective is needed for AI solutions to be used for a specific task. So the objective can be difficult to solve. So take facial recognition, which is really difficult. Like if you're looking for one one person in a sea of millions of photos, that is a complex problem, but it's easy to understand. So here, I just want to give you an example of an ambiguous objective. So I want to use, so say you just found out about AI. I want to use AI to make lots of money for my produce company. In order to turn that into something more specific, you want to look at, things like a specific task or a piece of information that is related to your business, and that could help you either make or save money. So in this instance, if you want to find the optimal shipping route for your company, and reintroduce the hortifruit example, we want to find the best or optimal shipping route for blueberries so that they don't spoil. That's a very specific objective, and that's something that you can easily turn into an AI problem. All right. Okay. So aside from an ambiguously defined problem, there's also the issue sometimes when the problem is not necessarily complex enough for AI. So, when we think about, there's a lot of excitement surrounding AI and machine learning, but it can be really easy to overlook some of the other tools that are perfectly capable of solving problems on their own. So we can ask ourselves, a couple of questions that might help us to say, hey, yes, this is definitely a problem we should use for machine learning or AI. So, basically you just want to ask yourself, can this problem be solved with another method? So sometimes common statistical methods can do wonders just in finding patterns in data. So to give you some context, or when you might want to use a statistical model, might be when you've got uncertainty, or uncertainty is like inherent in the data, and like the signal to noise ratio is pretty small. Or maybe you don't have a perfect training data set where you maybe can't repeatedly test one subject and have the outcomes assessed without an error. Or maybe you want to, just isolate the effects of a small number of variables. Maybe your sample size isn't very large. Or maybe you want the entire model to be interpretable. Like, those are questions that you might ask of your problem. And if you say yes to any of those, or if any of those sound like they could answer your problem, maybe you want to use a statistical method. Additionally, if it's possible to just use a set of rules or if-then scenarios to handle your problem entirely, then maybe there is no need for a machine learning solution. So take a rule, for example. If you can do something like, if a loan applicant has zero income, then refuse the loan. That is a simple rule, and you don't need a machine learning model for that. And I would just say also too, pretty much, if you can't find a successful outcome applying machine learning to your specific problem, so say you're doing research to see if anybody else has been successful in it, then maybe that's not the first step you should take with machine learning. I would say if you can, pretty much if you can, a rule of thumb might be, if you can explain exactly how to solve a problem using some sort of rule and equation, then the problem might be too simple to require AI. So let's talk about a few examples for a moment to give you some, just something to kind of chew on. So these are a couple of examples that are pretty well established. We've talked about them, and you've probably, seen them, or, read about them, or have tried them for yourself. But these are like use cases where AI or machine learning does well. And, just caution yourself that, even though these are very general examples, when you talk about these in the context of your specific business or organization, there might be things that are very individual, like very individual considerations that you might have to take into account when you're, attempting this problem. So there can be many different flavors to an email spam filter, for example. So let's talk about spam filters. So you could use rules to do some spam filtering. So think about this, like certain IP addresses are bad actors, so you can block those. But let's think about how much value there is in looking at this from like a personal or user perspective. So if you think about your inbox is going to look different from mine, then it's going to look different from anybody else's. So if you think about the way you kind of filter out messages you don't want to receive anymore, whether they're spam or, just junk or something that you don't want to use anymore, like we're automatically categorizing and filtering our inboxes, but it's very contextual and specific to the user. So if we think about that, there's lots of email volume, there's lots of users that are, taking those messages and marking them as spam. So, you as an organization, if, you were an email provider, you could take that information and then be able to use that for like a really good supervised learning problem, because you've got users marking messages as spam, and you can use those to train your machine learning model. So in this instance, you can use rules, but you can also use machine learning. All right, so in the second example, for fraud detection, whether that's credit card or transaction fraud, or sometimes even medical fraud, you can use rules as well. So again, usually you'll find out that, there's some sort of bad actor, whether it's a specific action or, it's coming from a specific location. And so you can use, once you know that information, then you can use that to filter out to make sure that it doesn't, infiltrate the rest of, the transactions. But let's think about realistically what happens with fraud. As soon as fraud is found out, there's a new way to kind of trick people into either giving up information or, defrauding a company out of money. So fraudsters work really quickly. And so you have to have a system in place that is adaptable and that can do real-time detection to be able to find those new signals that might be associated with a new type of fraud or a new group of fraudsters. So you can see that, as the behavior gets more complicated, it does require a machine learning solution, even though we could do some simple rule-based actions on, a specific set of data. Let's talk about something that, I don't think I've mentioned specifically, but which is realistic when we talk about, going and doing a search on the internet. So if you're not familiar with real-time bidding, basically it's like how advertisers kind of show you specific messages based off of a search. So let's think about like the big online advertisers. If they were to try to write a very specific set of rules that state, which ad is going to be displayed for a specific user to click, that could be like an unwieldy list, and one that would be constantly changing, and it's probably impossible to do. So in this case, you want to use machine learning to help find those patterns in user behavior and to help determine, which of the advertisements are going to be the most relevant to the specific user. So that's a complex problem. And as you can see, we're starting to talk more about like personalization, which really does lend itself well to an AI solution. And so the next one, speech recognition. This one is interesting because, just think about like how your voice is different from my voice, which is different from, someone who might live in another country. And so like the voices and the combinations of sounds and like the individual word pronunciations, there's so many of them. And then there's no like one single combination of, sounds, voices, pronunciations that specifically say this is human speech. But with machine learning, a machine can actually learn those patterns of speech and help to be able to convert that to, text or do some other sort of speech processing task. So again, we're talking about increasing complexity here. And then the last one that I'll just talk about briefly when we think about looking for use cases where AI or machine learning is appropriate, we also have product recommendations. So again, I'll make this personal for you. Think about, the way you shop. So if you shop in an online retailer, or if you watch movies from, one of the streaming services, or TV shows, or music, whatever, your personal preferences are going to be very specific to you. There may be users that like some of the same things that you do, but each one of us has like a specific set of preferences, and sometimes they change over time. So if we're introducing another level of complexity here, so a company that wants to take advantage of making like a product recommendation, whether it's a consumer good or music or something virtual, then you want to take all of those different data points, like the ratings, the reviews, other types of engagement that customers have with you. So like, what are you searching for? Just to name an example, you want to take all of that and then use that in conjunction with like the huge bank of items you have to either to recommend to the customer. And then you want to make predictions on what that user might want to buy or listen to or watch next. So, if we just think about like the number of interactions, that can become very complex as well. So, all of these problems that I just mentioned are really easy to understand, but they're complex to solve if you were to try to write a bunch of rules, or if then statements, or even to use a statistical method on. So that's what makes them good candidates for AI or machine learning. All right. So when we talk about, excuse me, potential AI projects, they really should be oriented around your core business problem, or an opportunity that you have, or some sort of challenge. And so to create a business solution with AI, the problems that you're solving have to be well defined and specific, but they can be as complex and far reaching as what the data that you have will allow for you to use. And so the problems your AI solution can solve may be in places that maybe you haven't just uncovered yet or tried yet, but are definitely things that are within your reach. And so one way to discover what is possible is to start to list as many problems as you can think of based on your pain points or your challenges or new business opportunities that come up, either by the way that customers are interacting with you, the way that your business is changing according to like market conditions, etc. So here I'm just listing a set of questions that might be something to help spur that conversation. So if you're the data scientist, it's helpful to know what kinds of questions might be important to business leaders. Business leaders, these are important questions to think of in terms of finding areas that may be good for automation or some sort of augmented decision-making tool. So the first one is, what are our most pressing problems? What are the most pressing problems that we're facing right now? So AI is a business tool, simply, and it's another tool in your arsenal, basically. So it can help make your organization more efficient or effective or profitable or streamlined. So, if you can start to list those questions and then prioritize them, then that may help you pick the right AI project. Another question might be, where would you like to cut costs? So, taking a look at, where all your costs are and figuring out the ones that you might want to reduce. AI can, really help you better understand where those costs are generated in your business. And so then you can start to look for ways to optimize or, change your business in order to reduce those costs. So I mentioned before, like logistics. That's probably a big one. If you can find optimal routes or, optimal shipping conditions, then, that sometimes does save you money. The next one. So what parts of your business have low profit margins? So, these are areas of your business that are profitable, or revenue streams that are profitable, but they have low profit, they have low margins. So this might be an opportunity to do some sort of automation, or acceleration using AI. In terms of, errors in work, I mean, that is a big deal in some, and in some sectors it's an even bigger one. But where in your business are there a large percentage of errors occurring? So an AI model here does have the capacity to perform with less error than human, because AI can take in, or AI solution can take in more information than a human can at times, and then be able to make decisions faster on lots of observations. And then the last major one might be an area which, depending on where you are in the organization, what parts of your work are least enjoyable. So, we see a lot of talk now about automation of some tasks that are like repetitive, or they're just really annoying to do. So that those might be opportunities for an artificial intelligence solution to come into play. Okay, so here I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about data. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about data in terms of AI, because that is an area where a lot of times you get stuck. I can say that speaking from personal experience. I've worked in financial services. I've worked in, a medical device manufacturing company. I've worked in, logistics and retail. And I've worked in companies that have been in various stages of maturity. So data, whether or not you have enough, whether you have the right amount of data, what kind of state it's in, those are all things that should be tackled strategically. And, data scientists have a big role to play in that. Data analysts have a big role to play in that. Business leaders should know, the right questions to ask, or be able to answer the questions that come when we talk about, the availability of data. What are you trying to use it for? So I do want to spend some time talking about it here, because we're not going to talk about it a lot in this kind of context later on in the course. So you already know that AI solutions are, built, and they are driven by data. I mean, that is the only way that AI works. And so organizations, you have to have some sort of data, and also have to think about, where are you going to source your data in the future? So you want to have a continuous cycle of data to keep your AI system up and running, because, there are lots of other considerations, like, after you get a solution ready, you have to think about, well, what happens if my data changes, or, what happens to the data source, or what if there are new data sources? So like, there's so many considerations with data when it comes to AI, but I just want to talk about the piece to getting started. But, data in and of itself is good, but AI does not, you can't just rely on any kind of data. So, and this is a huge challenge for some organizations to kind of deal with, because, there's so many things that could be happening. So if you're in a big, well-established organization, data might be spread all over the place. It could come from many different sources. And if you're a small company, you might not have enough data to be able to, when you're first getting started. So like, there's so many different ways to look at this. So let's talk about a few of the challenges that, few of the major challenges. So before any AI task can be pretty much ideated or evaluated, you really have to have a good data foundation. We talked about establishing a data culture, and this is so important, because without it, you're not going to be able to realize results. There won't be an ROI, and we all know that a lot of the reason why people want to use AI in their organizations is because they want to see some sort of return, whether that's making more money, saving money, finding new products, getting new features into the product. So data is at the foundation of all of that. So I'm going to tell you a story. So a popular medical device seller, they want to get more customers by predicting which prospective customers are likely to buy a new device from the firm. So the company has lots of data on their customers, lots of data on the devices, etc. That could be used to build a model, which is great when we're talking about an AI task. But and so if we were to be successful using a model like this, the sales and marketing team would be able to take advantage of, would be able to use that model to take advantage and bring in new customers. So when a data scientist looks closer at the data that we've got, or the data that, the company has, there were some problems that were uncovered. So the device seller only saved data on prospects that actually became customers. And so the information on the prospects that never became customers was kind of lost. And so the thinking was that, excuse me, that the data on customer conversions that failed weren't going to be valuable. So think about how useful that information would be to use in an AI model. From a human perspective, and from a non-analytical perspective, maybe that information, excuse me, isn't that important to you. But thinking about it from an AI perspective, that information would be super useful. Excuse me. So being able to compare those customers those prospects that became customers versus those that didn't is essential to modeling. But by not having that information, that actually sets you back in time to be able to create a useful model. So you have to, so in hindsight, or to be future minded, it's important to consider your problem carefully and where you're going to get your information. So we'll talk about how you do that so that you're prepared to have data and you're collecting data that you might use in the future. Excuse me. So a couple of challenges that I'll talk about here, and we'll talk about a little bit deeper in the subsequent sections, are that if you don't have much data to work with, you really just have only one solution, which is to get more of it. And we'll talk about where you can do that in just a second, because there's really no shortage of data. Well, there's lots of data being created every day, and sometimes it's about being creative with your data sources. But think about this too. On the other hand, having an almost unlimited supply of data may mean that it's in many different places, which is a challenge. And and also it could be scattered, especially during the collection process. And if you aren't the one collecting it, then that could be another, challenge that comes up as well. And then the quality could suffer. You have more control over data that you collect than you would someone else. So these, in addition to making AI tasks specific, the data that you have to use for these tasks have to be organized, easy to access, and good enough to be able to learn from. And preferably you want to have it all in the same place. So just let's think about this. If we're training a deep learning model, will we use small data or larger data? of course, we use larger data, but um, sometimes, if you're not thinking about it, you may pair a small data with an approach that requires large data. And so the result would be that the model would memorize the training data and it wouldn't learn anything really important or general from the data set itself. So in that case, you need lots of data to be able to get accurate conclusions. So let's talk about, even though there's fruit up here, let's talk about polling data, because I think that's something that's really relevant. So if you're surveying people, then you want to make sure that you have many types of people, not just a few types of people. That way you can get a better outcome or a better sense of what might be a winning outcome. So and so by doing that, you increase the probability that you can find a diverse set of features within that data set. So you want your data to be unique and plentiful. So, just to say this, we talked about, trying to classify whether or not a piece of fruit is an apple. And, sometimes being able to show you have to be able to show the machine lots of examples of apples of different colors, different shapes, different sizes, but you also have to show it other pieces of fruit so that it recognizes when something is really truly an apple and when it's not. We've talked about bias before, and I'll talk about this again because it is very important, and it's critical when you're trying to build solutions that have a human impact. And so, just to reiterate the places where bias can come from, depending upon how you collect the data, who's doing the collection, how the data is actually entered in whatever source or system it resides in, or how it's used in a model, there's a chance for either data or statistical or human bias to be introduced. So a machine learning model can definitely pick up on that bias and then therefore make biased predictions. So whether or not you're aware of it, you should be aware of it. So, that's just to say you should be aware of it. And so, just a couple of questions to ask yourself is, when you're going about collecting data for your problem, is, does this data represent all of the possible combinations of, users or scenarios that you are trying to model? And then do you have enough data to adequately train your model? So that goes back to like the diverse data and the lack of data challenge. But specifically examine your data for bias. So we talked about quality data. And so like access to quality data is probably one of the harder parts when you're trying to get up and running with AI. So, let's just look at some common problems and then talk about some ways to address them. So I do see a question about how do you determine when the data is sufficient to do the data modeling? Is it by volume or quality or both? And I do believe that what I'm about to share with you should answer that question. So, when we talk about, so if there's no like central data ownership or, departments within your organization pretty much kind of do their own thing, they capture data, they store it, and, they make their own rules about, how to use it or not use it, then you can imagine how hard it would be to know exactly what you have and what shape it's in terms of quality. So one of the fixes for that would be to think about, a company data policy or some sort of data governance. And we talked about that in the last week, but, just to break it down simply. So if a data policy doesn't exist, then you should create one. But if it does exist and it's outdated or it doesn't match with, where your business is going, then you should make changes to it to match your current and future state. So in addition to doing a data policy, you also want to take a data inventory within the company. So you can think about, you can start to take stock of all of the different data that you have. Where is it? How much is it? Like how, like, is it missing? You know, if you start to label your data, you might start to see some issues with that data and using it for an analytic purpose. And then you also want to talk about or think about, you know, what steps do you need to take to make sure that you've got current data. So I mentioned before, you need a continuous cycle of data for AI projects. So you might have to figure out how or where you're going to access it from. So taking all of these steps early on is going to make it, it's going to reduce the time and effort to be able to realize the value from AI initiatives, because you'll be more efficient due to the fact that you did the work early on your data problem. Um, so, you know, just going on, all of these really are related to quality in some sense and volume in some sense. So the next one is, um, so in your company, there might also be places where you're generating data, but you're never capturing it. So the example that I mentioned before, or where, you know, the seller was finding excuse me, didn't save the data on prospective customers that didn't convert. That's a good example. So, you know, just think about other examples in, or maybe within your organization where, you know, you're going through a process, there is valuable information being generated, but you don't capture it at the end of the day, or even if you do capture it, it's kind of erased at the end of the day. So, you know, this is common, especially if you're not thinking about, if you're not clear that the data that data that's being generated could actually be used in the future. So a lot of AI projects really require lots of data sometimes. So like that could be years worth of data, depending on, you know, just how often the action, or, you know, whatever happens. So like, what is the cadence of the particular data capture. So, so sometimes it's good to think that even if you're not going to use the data right away, or you don't know how to use it, it might be something valuable to capture. I mean, of course, there are other considerations like, you know, is it ethical to capture it? You know, taking into consideration privacy concerns. But for the most part, you know, if you've got, if you can find places in your business where you're not capturing data, but it might be something that could help you with a core business problem or an opportunity or challenge, then you might want to start to think about ways to capture that information. So the fix for that would be to just start with a list. You know, take note of every place within your organization or related to your company where you generate data, and then look at the business processes from all corners of your business. And if there's data that you can capture, so, you know, basically there's data pretty much in like processes and interactions and in procedures. So go one by one to see if it's possible to collect that data and then store it from that source. So, you know, data storage and capture is becoming so much easier and cheaper than it used to be. So that shouldn't be something that deters you. And then also, you know, a lot of tasks are supervised learning tasks. So labeling it, especially if you can label your data and while it's being captured, is going to lend itself to being better data than trying to label data that maybe you had no role in capturing, or maybe you're not really sure, you know, the genesis of that data. But labeled data is good data when you need it. So the lack of good data is actually different from the lack of data itself. So you can have a ton of information, but if it's not related to the task at hand, it's really not going to be useful to you. So you want data that is actually data that's going to be used in training that is of high enough quality that it can answer your questions. So sometimes it might mean you have to consider new collection methods or new data quality standards. And then the last one is, you know, sometimes companies just don't generate enough data of their own. So I mentioned before, you might be a new company. Um, so if you think about it, like I mentioned before, lots of data is created everywhere. And sometimes that data from some organizations they're capturing, but they might not be able to use. So there are a number of ways to get information that uh, could be affordable or free. And it shouldn't, and it's usually not that hard. So, one of the things we talked about was taking a data inventory. And so every part of your business has the potential to create or provide some data to you. So whether that's in website interactions or, each time a customer places an order or when you send an email response to a customer, those are all data sources. Um, and so for every source, there might be an application for its use, whether it's your company using it or another company that might use an anonymized version. And at the same time, there's a lot of data sources that are already public and free. So, if you needed to use satellite imagery or weather data, there are plenty of news articles out there. There's so much data potential that if you're just creative enough, you can probably find to be able to get you to that first AI project. Um, let me pause here and answer a question here about data. So there's one that says for any new startup that is trying to bootstrap, um, how do you determine which data to store? How will that trade-off be made? I think, if you're a new company that is trying to, get a leg up, money is probably a concern. And so sometimes looking for those open source or public data sources are really good. Sometimes it might be partnering with another company to, share data. So perhaps you have some data that your company would be generating. Because remember, I said there's potential to generate data in many parts of an organization. So, but really it is about being creative and trying to find that data solution. And, the trade-off is going to be very specific to you. So, is it time that is your constraint? Is it, money that's your constraint? Is it the fact that, your problem is very specific and nobody really has the data that you need? That might be a constraint. So you really just have to take all of those things, list them, prioritize them, and then figure out ways to kind of move the process along. So hopefully that answered your question. Um, there's another question about public or free data. So how do you determine that the data is of quality and free of any bias? So there's plenty of ways to look for data quality. So data quality could be, is it really helpful to the business problem that you're looking at? Is simple things like, is the data missing? Are there like erroneous values within a field? Are there incomplete values in the field? Do you even know what the field means? Those are all things that you can ask yourself of, public data sets. In terms of bias, that one becomes a little bit harder. So like I mentioned before, the two questions to ask yourself, basically, does the data kind of capture all of the kind of situations, circumstances, or customers that you might be looking to use in your model? And so if you know that there's a certain category that is not represented, you know that there is going to be some bias in that data. And you can use tools, and we'll talk about some of H2O's specific AI tools to use to look for bias. But there are tools that you can use that when you do use a model, or when you do model, you can look at the predictions to see if there's any sort of bias or lack of fairness in your prediction. And sometimes that is an indicator, again, to the data that you actually use. So you sort of have to ask yourself that question, even if you're using a free or public data source. Does this represent what I'm actually trying to do? Is this data enough for what I'm trying to predict? All right. So just a couple of quick tips for reducing time to start with AI that are not just about data. It's about, so the first is, beginning with a priority problem. Again, that I think that will relate to the startup question. Um, you know, Pick the biggest impact problem first that you can realistically solve. And then, go from there. The second one is if you have tons of data that are unstructured or disparate or scattered, then you're probably going to spend a lot of time trying to clean that data before you can even get started on your problem and learn from that information. So instead, maybe choose a problem that might be supervised with historical data that's relevant to your problem. So you want to find data that's clean or very easy to clean and use accurately labeled data to help you start finding those actionable insights. The next one is sometimes you may have a ton of data, but it may not be relevant due to the pace in which your business processes change. So there are a couple of industries that, where there's a high velocity of data or things change really rapidly, or the predictions need to be in real time. So things like e-commerce or on-demand services, you really do need data that is new and fresh, or more recent than some historical data. So delivery services or other on-demand services related to things like transportation or grocery delivery, may mean that you rely more on current data than maybe a business like insurance, where you don't necessarily, or you're not looking for that, high velocity or highly volatile data. So predictive value is going to come from data that is relevant to your business and that can also uncover the trends and the nuances of your industry and your specific business. And then the last thing is, we've already talked about having labeled data earlier. So, if you can collect data early in the process and label it at the time, that's great. So if you're trying to use AI for the first time, a good starting point might be to find a use case where you have historical and relevant labeled data. So, maybe you're looking at fraud. You might already have labeled instances of fraud that can be used to predict other transactions that are most likely to be fraudulent. So if you look through like your purchases, your purchase location, customer type, and volume of chargebacks, you might automatically have some fraud labeled observations, which will speed up the time that you actually get started on the fraud prediction. If you're, just imagine like using customer support emails. So, you might have a ton of information where you've got support tickets, and, maybe they could be, labeled things like technical issues, refund requests, or delivery issues, among a number of other different categories. You could choose to use an AI solution that would instantly label those incoming, customer support emails, and then by the type that you already have labeled. So you can train the model on those labeled observations and then categorize new email. So those are common use cases where you may already have good labeled data that could service your use case well. All right. So far I've covered a loose set of points to think about when you're crafting your AI problem, but there are a couple of other things that you should remember when you're trying to get it right. And the first one is there room in your solution to accept some allowance of error? So any machine learning or AI solution that you undertake will often be incorrect a certain percentage of the time. So, and that's especially true when encountering new or unseen data it wasn't trained on. So if your solution absolutely cannot allow for any type of error, then machine learning is likely not going to be the right tool for that job by itself. So, let's just think about this, and I'm going to talk dollars and cents here in a second. So if you're trying to create a solution that will will automatically read an invoice and then turn around and pay that invoice, an error in something like misreading a letter or a number or even a decimal place could result in things like either overpayment, underpayment, paying the wrong person, etc. So, you can understand how painful that would be. So instead, maybe you use a machine learning model to bucket or categorize those invoices and then have a human send the final payment instead. So you can think, of other industries where, using machine learning or AI would need to be carefully considered, like healthcare or, those really high impact decisions. So, many times automation of certain decisions will free up time for humans to make the critical ones that are good enough use cases to undertake, especially when error, is of high concern. So that's when you might want humans in the loop. So we've talked a lot about data and how AI requires a lot of information. So your responsibility is not just to feed your algorithm data, you also have to consider the context. So a machine learning model is great for looking for patterns, but a machine is not going to know the context around certain, data points that could make, a prediction irrelevant. So, when you're developing a machine learning solution, you have to consider the context, because in not doing so, you might risk, reputational embarrassment or, harm, or maybe you just have useless predictions. So, I'll just give you one example here. So let's just say you're an e-commerce retailer and you heavily promoted a product for a sale last year, and so you saw a big rise in cases, or big rise in sales, um, but you've created a product recommendation that didn't take that into account, and so you're recommending a product to people who had no intent in buying that product because you didn't consider the fact that, hey, there was a sale going on at that time. So basically, in coming up with that product recommendation, you should account for the fact that there was promotional pricing and advertising going on, and not, an organic customer interest. So that's an example of context. So you can't just feed data into a system. You have to also think about the things that are the things that were happening either at the time of collection or, specific to the question that you're asking. So there are a couple of other ones like personalized medicine. So you're not going to treat first, second, and third degree burn victims the same in terms of recovery, because that it would take more time for a second and third degree burn victim to recover than a first degree burn victim. But if you don't account for that in the data, then a machine is not going to pick up on that. It's not going to know that. And for customer lifetime value, maybe you're looking for high, a high lifetime value customer, or a set of high lifetime value customers, but you don't consider the fact that, maybe there was a retention program going on at that time that, although it brought in new sales or it kept customers, it didn't break even. And so if you're not going to use that program in the future, you've got to make sure that that is not represented in the data. So context really is everything. And so I'll just summarize what we've talked about here, and then I'll leave the floor open for a couple of questions. So building an AI solution really does require careful thinking and testing throughout all of the steps of the process. And you're going to see that even more so when we talk about the intro to machine learning and intro to deep learning. So there's no real one out of the box solution for unique or complex business cases. And, even for the common ones, and I mentioned this earlier, like product recommendations or trying to predict customer churn, each application of machine learning or AI is going to vary, but it's all going to require you to work iteratively and make adjustments. So I'm just trying to say that, don't go into this without the proper resources, which usually are time and sometimes money and talent. Um, to be able to, so you should be able to commit enough time to be able to try out a trial and error kind of iterative um, process so that you can actually see some results. So just a couple of things that I've talked about in terms of your business problem and the data. Your problem has to be specific. It cannot be broad. Your data can be a limitation, but it can definitely be overcome. Error should be expected with machine learning models, so you have to decide how to deal with that. And then the lack of context can make predictions useless or harmful. So just remember those things. Just so you know, the study group and the Ask Me Anything this week are going to be held on Saturday and Sunday at 7 a.m. We are going to start Module 3 next week, the Intro to Machine Learning. The next study group and Ask Me Anything sessions will be held later in the day. But they'll still be on Saturdays and Sundays, but they'll be held at 10 a.m. Pacific. So let me pause here. We've got 1 minute to see if there is another question that I can answer. Is biased data a problem in AI solutions? Yes, biased data is definitely an issue in AI solutions. It can lead to, harmful predictions or, deny. So, if we're talking about, finance, if you're trying to be approved for a loan, if a model is biased against you for whatever reason, whether it's the fact that you've used some sort of, sensitive feature in your model, like gender or sex or education or zip code, sometimes those things are biased information, and it can definitely be problematic with AI. How does the compliance standards such as HIPAA impact data collection for AI, or does it complement the AI process implementation? I would say when you're in your data governance or data policies, you definitely have to consider things like privacy. So not just HIPAA, but like GDPR, the California data privacy laws. Those should all be considerations when you take into account what information you collect, how you store it, how long you store it, what you use it for, and how you alert customers when something happens. Like, you have to have all of those things in place. So it's really good to have a really robust data governance and data review policy. And in lots of organizations, there are restrictions placed on what data you can actually use in an AI model. There are lots of cases where using personal data is not necessary for prediction. So yes, all of those things, those HIPAA regulations do matter when we talk about, data collection and use. Let's see. I think that's the other questions we'll answer like offline, but thank you all for joining today. And if you have questions, definitely use the discussion and attend the study group and ask me anything, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.